everyone, welcome back to my channel and welcome to Thriller Thursday. So for today's video I'm talking about the Albert Fish case. Now this is the first case that I am covering on a serial killer or a murderer. It wasn't actually confirmed that he killed multiple people, but a lot of people think he did. And before I start, I'd just like to say that I mean no offence by making these cases. They are just for educational and awareness purposes. So like I said, this case is on Albert Fish. Albert Fish was born on the 19th of May 1870 and was the youngest out of 4 siblings. Albert's childhood wasn't the best. His dad was actually 42 years older than his mum, and when his dad died at the age of 70, his mum struggled quite a lot financially to support the family. So because of this, she ended up putting Albert into an orphanage. The orphanage he got sent to was the Albert and St. John orphanage in Washington DC. He didn't have a very good experience in the orphanage either. He got beaten daily and made fun of quite a lot, so yeah, it wasn't a good time. But during his time in the orphanage was when he discovered his interests in physical pain. When Albert turned 9, his mum was then able to look after her children and was more financially stable, so she took Albert back from the orphanage. And then in 1890, Albert actually moved to New York on his own, and this is where things go downhill. In New York, Albert began to rape young boys and became a male prostitute, so his head obviously wasn't screwed on properly. This all continued over to his arranged marriage, which was set up by his mum in 1898, and he actually had 6 children with this woman. In 1898, he also became a painter and decorator, but started to molest young boys, usually under the age of 6. And this all happened while he was still married to his first wife. There's not a lot of information on their relationship, but it was over 100 years ago, which is probably why. But as you can tell, it probably wasn't the best. In 1910, Albert met a 19-year-old boy called Thomas Kaden, and the two of them began a sadist type of relationship. And if you don't know what the word sadist means, it's basically where the two of them enjoy the feeling of pain and get pleasure out of it. Albert ended up taking Thomas to an old farmhouse and began to torture him. He tied him up and mutilated him. Albert's original plan was to actually murder Thomas, but he was really nervous as it was his first time and he was worried that he would get caught. So he left Thomas in the old farmhouse, kissed him goodbye, and then got the first train home. And then after this, it wasn't actually confirmed of what happened to Thomas. So yeah, no one knows what happened to him. Albert's mental state took a turn for the worst in 1917 when his wife left him for another man named John Straub, and this made him go crazy. Albert started hallucinating and seeing things that weren't actually there. 2 years later, in 1919, Albert stabbed an intellectually disabled boy as he thought no one would miss him, and basically as if he wasn't important, which is really wrong. He also admitted to hiring other men and boys to go to him so he could do what he wanted to them. I'm not sure what that sort of entailed, but I'm sure you can imagine. Albert always chose people that in his mind wouldn't be missed, people who he thought were less important, and as if no one would care if they were gone. So that is pretty much the story behind Albert Fish. I'm now going to go into a specific story, like a case of his, and this victim is named Grace Budd. In 1928, there was an ad placed in a newspaper by a young man named Edward Budd, and he was looking for work. He placed this ad as his family was struggling financially, and they thought if he got a job, he could maybe help to support his family. So they placed this ad in the newspaper, and the next day a man turned up at the Budd residence, known as Frank Howard. This man was about 5'5", weighed 130 pounds, and dressed as if he had a lot of money. Delia Budd, Edward's and Grace's mum, said the only thing weird about this man was his teeth. So some of his teeth were rotten, and he did have a couple missing as well. And she described these teeth as animal teeth. And obviously, if this man had a lot of money, why wouldn't you get your teeth done? So the man, who identified himself as Frank Howard, said that he saw Edward's ad in the newspaper and wanted to hire him to come and work on his farm with him. Edward was so happy because he could tell this man had a lot of money just by looking at him, and thought that he could help support his family, so he jumped at the chance. He also asked if his friend could come and work with him as well, and Frank was absolutely fine with this. Everyone was so happy and excited, and the man, Frank Howard, said that he would return the following week to pick up Edward and his friend and take him to the farm. So Frank Howard leaves and returns the following week, but doesn't actually come on the day he was supposed to. He ended up coming the day after. At 11 AM on the morning, he turned up at the Budd residence, but Edward and his friend weren't actually ready to go yet. They still hadn't finished packing. So their mum, Delia, let Frank Howard into the living room to sit and wait until the boys were ready. While he was sat waiting, 10-year-old Grace Budd walked through the living room, and immediately Frank grew a massive interest for her, and she did for him, but obviously not in the same way. She went over and sat on his lap, and he had some money in his pocket. I think it was about $91, and he got this out, just showing her, and they were just talking. And this was when Frank decided to ask Delia if he could take Grace to his niece's birthday party, which was happening near to where they lived, and he said they had a couple hours to spare anyway, as the boys were still getting ready. Delia was a bit hesitant to start with, but she knew this man had quite a lot of money and knew that Grace would have a good time, so she said yes. Frank said that there would be a couple hours, so they both left and walked off. Not only did Delia not know that the address that Frank had given her for his niece's birthday party wasn't actually real, she also didn't know that the man who identified himself as Frank Howard was actually Albert Fish. So Albert Fish did not bring Grace home. A couple hours passed, and then the whole night passed, and there was still no sign of Albert or Grace. It wasn't until the next morning that Delia Budd contacted the police, and an immediate investigation started. So all of this happened a long time ago, so obviously they didn't have the same technology as they do nowadays, and they also didn't know that Albert had a past history of violence. They didn't even know that this was Albert. They pretty much had nothing to go off of, as they were looking for a man called Frank Howard, not Albert Fish. The police tried everything, but everything took them to a dead end. Every tip turned to a dead end, and this went on for weeks, months, and then years. And this case went on for a total of 6 years. The main detective in this case was a man called Will King, and he was the only one really continuing with this case, as everyone else had given up hope. But Will King was determined to find out what had happened to Grace Budd. On the 2nd of November 1934, Delia contacted Will King and told him that she received a letter from an anonymous person and that it had connections with her daughter's disappearance. So Will King receives this letter and reads it. The letter was really disturbing and quite graphic, so I'll sum it up for you, but if you would like to go and have a look, it's on the internet, but yeah. So this letter was addressed to Delia and included everything that Albert had done to her daughter. Pretty much what had happened, Albert said as soon as Grace sat on his lap, this was when he knew that he wanted to eat her. Albert Fish was a cannibal. He took Grace to an abandoned house. He didn't rape her, he actually strangled her until she passed away, and he did various things with her body until he proceeded to eat her. And it took him 9 days to complete this process. So as disturbing and horrific as that was for her mum to hear, Will said that this was a break in the case. There was a little emblem on the envelope of the letter that was sent to Delia, which had the initials NYPCBA, and this stood for the New York Private Chauffeur Benevolent Association. So Will King went down to this association and asked everyone if they used the letters for their own personal use. And a man called Leo Sykowski told Will King that he had used the letters for his own personal use, and he did this while he was living in his old apartment, and he actually left the letters there when he moved. Obviously everyone still thinks that this man is called Frank Howard, so Will went up to the landlady of this apartment complex and described Frank Howard physically and asked her if she knew anyone like that. And the landlady immediately said, yes, that's Albert Fish. And from here everything changed, as now they knew that Frank Howard doesn't exist. Will King stayed at this complex for days and nights until finally on December the 12th, 1934, he caught and arrested Albert Fish in the apartment that he was renting. He took him down to the station and immediately he confessed. He told the police everything in very graphic detail and also took him to the house where the murder occurred. In March 1934, Albert was convicted of murder and kidnap and was charged to the death penalty with the electric chair. Albert was actually really excited, as like I said earlier on, he was someone who enjoyed physical pain, and he said that this was going to be the thrill of his life. Albert Fish was put to death on the electric chair on the 16th of January 1936, but he only ever confessed to killing Grace Budd and no one else. But like I said at the start of the video, people believe that he killed multiple other people because of what he was like. And that is everything for this case. So this is obviously solved. He was a murderer. So yeah, different to what I usually do. Let me know down below if you would like me to do more murderer or serial killer cases, as things like that really interest me, weirdly or not. But yeah, let me know down below and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one.